The question of what is better, AAA or indie, is a simple binary choice, but why the hell is nobody talking about AA? That is a question that was posed to me recently in a comment which basically said, so many videos on YouTube like yours, Roy, talks about AAA versus indie as if they're the only options, and they forget all about AA, and in the case of my video, yeah, you're right. I had completely overlooked AA gaming, and I think there is a good reason for that. And in this video, I'm going to talk about why I think this classification is often forgotten and unmentioned. Not the games, by the way. Everybody knows the best AA games, but the production value, well, that is forgotten. And then I'm going to go on to say why I think, bold statement, they could be the best thing for the future of the gaming industry. Please do let me know in the comments what your favourite AA game is, and please do smash that like button as it really helps the video to grow. Thank you. Now, for most people, something that rolls off Ubisoft's production line in the Assassin's Creed series with dev teams the size of a small village and huge budgets that could fund a war is a AAA title, while Stardew Valley is an obvious indie game, with a one-person dev team in the form of Eric Baroni realising his dream. The AA game sits somewhere between these two examples, and the problem is, there's a huge emphasis on somewhere, because it is pretty difficult to define exactly where a game stops being indie or a AA becomes a AAA. Let me talk about one of my favourite games. Subnautica is an amazing survival experience, one of the most terrifying near-pant-crapping experiences I have ever had. I didn't, for the record. Those leviathans nearly gave me a heart attack. I also didn't have one of those. If you know, you know. It's brilliant. And if you haven't heard of it or you haven't checked it out, please do. And for me, Subnautica is a great example of a AA game. Well, at least I thought it was when I started researching for this video. But along the way, I learnt that it had earned an Indie Choice Award, not a AA Choice Award, and I've seen it mentioned in reviews as indie, which technically, confusingly, it is, because it's made by an independent studio, but just with a bigger budget than many other indie titles. A Gamerpedia article has a handy chart to help us compare the three classifications of games. It keeps it vague and it comes with few concrete stats, but it basically says game budgets are variable between 1 and 50 million, which, well, that's quite a scale. And the article says marketing budgets are somewhere between indie and AAA games, which is great, that's really clear. And that team sizes tend to be under 50 people, and that pretty much cleared up nothing for me. But there was something written in the Gamerpedia article that really did help me define what they are. AA games usually have better graphics and audio quality than indies. We know that games like Plague Tale, Hellblade and Kingdom Come Deliverance look and feel a bit different to games like Stardew, FTL and Darkest Dungeon. I am not saying that something like Hollow Knight isn't beautiful. Arguably, it's one of the most stunning games I've ever played. But if you look at something like Plague Tale, the lighting effects and the graphics are closer to a AAA game. Many games that have that classification of AA are 3D and prioritise audio and visual, but they still focus on things like innovation, mechanics and storytelling. However, they are not as cutting edge in terms of visuals as their AAA big brothers. But sadly though, because they often focus on better audio and graphics, it means they often get compared unfairly to AAA games. Now, here's a good example. I enjoyed Greedfall's story and innovation, but I was really distracted by some of the repeated textures for buildings and the facial animations, which were yeah. Looking back though, I regret not giving the game more time because honestly, I think I was judging a AA game against AAA expectations. Obsidian's Outer Worlds is another great example. For me, I didn't enjoy the boxed-in feeling of the environment, the story felt somewhat linear, very predictable, and it didn't have enough twist. But oh my god, I've got to say, it looked amazing, and I think many of us were hoping for Fallout New Vegas 2, but there probably wasn't the budget to make something that big or open. I should have probably looked at it a bit different, but then still, to my mind, that game grates on me a little bit. Maybe I'll make a video down the line. But I do have to say, when some AA games release with AAA price tags, it does invite comparison. Arguably more fairly this time, because smaller budgets, less overheads, but the same damn price doesn't necessarily lead to overly favourable gamer opinion. Why am I paying that much for a game that costs you less? But the honest reason I think a lot of reviewers or content creators like me don't really talk about AA classification as much as indies or AAA, or even mention the term, is because of that vagueness. Because if they put their head on the block and they call a game AA when it's not, it's kind of embarrassing. But if they lump them in with the indies, which technically they're right, because, you know, usually it is an independent studio, possibly with more experienced devs, making a bigger budget game, then that is fine. Maybe it is better to call a game like Subnautica a high-end indie, rather than a low-budget premium game. And with terms like AAA, AAA+, and God help us, quadruple A also being bandied around, this talk about classification is only going to get more confusing. And that is possibly why the AA classification isn't really talked about. Because the AB choice of indie and AAA is easier to argue over when you don't muddle it with the confusion, the 50 shades of AA grey that lives in the no man's land between the two. So, we know AA games exist, we know why they're not often talked about, but at the start of this video, I made a pretty bold claim. I suggested that AA games could save the gaming industry. Now, at this moment, this type of game seems more often than not to be in the stomping ground of indie devs with cash. But what if they no longer exclusively were made by independent studios? If we simply go with the definition that AA games are mid-budget games with reasonable sized development teams, not the small villages of people that make AAA games, the games that we now call AA would basically have the budget of a AAA game from the 7th generation of consoles, the PS3 era. In my video on AAA versus indie, I said that I felt AAA games are a little bit formulaic these days, that's an understatement, that most of them seem to be these open world, third-person action RPGs, and it was getting a bit stale. Oh god, is it getting stale? And I went on to say that in these huge teams that make these AAA titles, people's ideas get lost and innovation is sacrificed. And in my closing statement, I begged that if only these huge, big developers could set aside some cash, split off some devs to work on a side project that was more indie-like in budget and team size, then the world would be a better place. But in truth, the idea of some huge developer working on projects like FTL is ridiculous. And there's a risk that if they flop, they're going to be seen as a cash grab or an uninnovative attempt to copy the creativity of a single developer's dream. And on top of that, I don't think many big developers would necessarily want their company associated with a game that didn't have the latest high-end graphics or production techniques. Besides, can you imagine a huge studio making something like Stardew Valley and supporting it for as long as Eric Baroni has, adding free update after update, adding more and more features without ever charging, instead relying on new purchases of the game? But seriously though, what indie fan hasn't got this game? Who doesn't own it? But he keeps plodding on, updating and updating, and I think that guy's amazing. If a big game developer made something like Stardew, it would be littered with microtransactions and loot boxes, which, as much as it pains me to say, I understand, I get it. Big developers have hundreds of people on their books and they've got bills to pay. So perhaps those sorts of indie games are best left in the hearts and dreams of people who see them as a passion project, and hopefully they turn into very lucrative ones for a small team or a solo dev. But AA games, on the other hand, well, that, my friends, is a different story. Many first-time indie devs, well, they don't have the budget, the tech, or the know-how to make something like Subnautica. As we've learned from this video, AA games aim to look high-end, but they innovate, which is something I think a huge developer could get behind. Instead of throwing hundreds of millions of pounds at one AAA game, why not split it into 6, 7, 8 parts, get those smaller teams out there, and make something real? I mean, instead of Rockstar making one game a generation, I mean, seriously, I remember a time when Rockstar actually made games. Why can't they do it again? Why don't they pump money into smaller projects, split that big development budget into 5, 6, 10 parts and make 10 different games? Pump money into the smaller projects with smaller teams in which ideas are heard and emphasis is on innovation, creating games like Subnautica and Plague Tale. I think in the past, developers like Rockstar, they took more chances. They made things like Table Tennis and a series like Manhunt or Midnight Club, and God, I miss those games. Now, I've often said that indie games remind me of the 90s era games. That time when everything was raw and it was new and it felt like boundaries were being pushed with every new release. But what I have come to realise of late is that AA games remind me of the mid-2000s to early 2010s, when so many IPs were popping, and the games, they felt original and innovative, yet they looked polished and incredible. This is the sort of games I want to bring back. And if anybody from AAA land is listening, I'm sure that in your huge dev teams, working on the same game franchise, making the same games over and over again, there are people with dreams. Dreams of making something fresh. The kind of games and ideas that gamers like me and like you would love. But maybe these people, they're too scared to go out on their own. Or they want to keep the production values high, but they can't afford it. Indie devs don't always have the budgets to make these big AA games, but huge studios, you do. Take a chance and make something new. Make a AA game. And here is a revolutionary thought. If the teams are smaller, budget lower, and overheads less, maybe you could charge us less in the long run and not fill it with loot boxes. But that, my friends, well, that may be a wish too far. Do let me know in the comments what your favourite AA game is, and please do smash that like button as it genuinely helps me out. Thanks. But from me today, all it leaves me to say is thank you very much for watching, and this is Roy McCoy, out.